around 1976 when the information about the 3D characteristics of the Shroud came out. He is moderator and member of the Shroud Science Group, which is an online international community of scientists, historians, and other serious investigators who research the Shroud. He concentrates primarily on image processing and the image characteristics of the Shroud, but also maintains an interest in all the other aspects of Shroud studies. Dr. Schneider.
Thanks, Joe. Well, we have a tight schedule. Let's see if I can get this. Oh, no, that didn't work. All right. Well, I'm going to read my talk this morning because, quite frankly, half an hour is almost impossible for me. I'm used to standing up and talking interminably until the students finally all fall asleep. So we'll begin by making the point that the Shroud of Turin either wrapped the body of Jesus of Nazareth or it's a 14th century artifact. Joseph Campbell analyzed the myth of the hero's journey. Our quest is truth, and we need guides. Each of our guides has a unique perspective. Whether science, history, archaeology, art, personal witness, or religion, each seeks to illuminate the truth. For the ultimate test of story is whether it is true. But what is truth? Pontius Pilate asked Jesus. Truth is the correspondence between story and reality. The Apostle Thomas declared, "Unless I see, I will not believe." Direct witness, correct interpretation, correspondences among known truths, and coherence are the tests of truth. On October 13th, 1988, representatives from Carbon Labs at Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich announced the Shroud dated from between 1260 and 1390 AD. The Shroud was medieval, and therefore not a true relic of Christ. For the public, that settled matters. They could go back to their reality shows confident that the Shroud was a fake. I must have missed the memo that carbon dating was infallible. I share Richard Feynman's belief in profound existential skepticism. Confident dogmatism has caused tremendous suffering. It is more important to have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. Ignorance is better than subscribing to something that isn't true. What's wrong with carbon dating? The 1988 carbon dating abandoned the original protocol. A single sample from a known contaminated site was selected. The Carbon Labs failed to document their work thoroughly. A chi-square of 6.4 shows the sample was not homogeneous. Brian Walsh showed that the dates had a linear gradient with a 70% correlation between date and location along the sample. Analysis by John Morgan on the ultraviolet fluorescence image gave a correlation, an amazing correlation of 99.9% for the average date and the UV fluorescence. That's such a high correlation, it strongly suggests that the date was produced by contamination that fluoresced. The 1988 carbon date, at best, is unreliable. The 1988 date poisoned the well. It was treated by the Carbon Labs as overwhelmingly authoritative, and that's just not the case. Large errors in carbon dating are not unusual, and this carbon dating was a very flawed process. Professor Edward Hall of Oxford University reflected the bias when he said, "There was a £1,000,000 business in making forgeries during the 14th century. Someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it." The scholarship done on the Shroud prior to 1988 did not deserve summary dismissal. Carbon dating isn't the last word. What must be true of this super forger who just got a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it? Against all Christian art traditions, Superforger created an image with a helmet of thorns, nails through the wrists, and a myriad of scourge marks matching a Roman instrument unused for almost 1,000 years. Superforger put serum rings around the bloodstains using real blood. He added burn holes to match a 12th century Hungarian manuscript. He added rare limestone from Jerusalem on the nose, knee, and heel. Superforger stitched a side strip onto the cloth with a sewing technique from the 1st century. He also added discoloration to the cloth, representing a device used to display the shroud over 100 years before in Constantinople. Superforger is just super. Richard Feynman said, "If you don't have a really compelling reason for something, you have to have several reasons." Superforger wants his fake relic to be truly remarkable, so it is easier to flog it. A negative image, an anatomically perfect blood stains, an image without pigment, that's the ticket. He added pollens to the cloth to show it traveled from Jerusalem to Edessa, to Constantinople, and to France. The masterful touch was putting dirt from Jerusalem to the nose, knees, and feet. He mastered ancient Roman crucifixion practices by going back in a time machine and creating a separate relic, which he put in circulation from Jerusalem. Implausible? Let's begin at the beginning. Either the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, or it was created by our superforger with a time machine. He created a fake so compellingly authentic that seemingly only a paranormal forger could accomplish it. What about authenticity? Our journey begins in a 1st century tomb. The two most plausible crucifixion dates are April 7th, 30 AD, or April 3rd, 33 AD. In 33 AD, a lunar eclipse occurred with the moon turning to blood, fulfilling a passage from the prophet Joel, preached by Peter on Pentecost. The Gospel of John reveals at least 2 cloths in the empty tomb, one to wrap the body and one used on his head, but was now rolled up in a place by itself. We still have 2 cloths, the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo. Perhaps there were some additional cloths in the empty tomb, a sheet used to carry the body. Pilgrims report an 8-foot shroud with no mention of an image. A cap is preserved at Cahors, which could explain the lack of image at the top of the head. A shroud was also destroyed by the French Revolution in Besançon. Until the Edict of Milan in February 313, Christians were a persecuted minority. The existence of a shroud bearing the image of Jesus was a secret. Discovered, it would have been seized and destroyed. A burial cloth is, it made the one ritually unclean. An image of one who was God and Lord was both blasphemous and lawless to the Jews and foolish to the Gentiles. After persecution ended the Christians could still not be certain it would not return. Best it be kept secret. Eusebius, in his church history, tells the legend of Abgar V, king of Edessa until 50 A.D., who wrote to Jesus asking him to come and cure him of his leprosy. Eusebius mentions no cloth or image. Internal textual evidence dates the legend to the 3rd century and likely under the reign of Abgar VIII, who died in 212. Over time, the legend grew, first to report a face of Christ painted in choice colors, then later an image created by Christ himself as a moist secretion. Hidden away in the city walls over the western gate and forgotten, it was only rediscovered around 525. It was used in 544 in defense of the city against the Persians. In 1978, Ian Wilson published his seminal book, The Shroud of Turin, the Burial Cloth of Jesus Christ. He identified the Shroud of Turin as the image of Edessa, the Mandylion. The shroud had been taken to Edessa by Thaddeus, a disciple of the Lord, and used to cure Abgar V. The Mandylion was hidden in the walls of Edessa, forgotten and rediscovered in 525. Jack Marquardt proposes that Peter had custody of the shroud, and when church persecution began, Peter went to Antioch. There it disappeared when it was concealed to protect it, and the person who hid it was martyred. Only rediscovered in the aftermath of an earthquake in 528, it was evacuated to Edessa to avoid capture by the Persian army in 540. 4 years later, in 544, it miraculously protected the city. Neither story is particularly convincing. However, the Mandylion is in Edessa in 544, where it remains for 400 years. Paul Vignon, an early scientific shroud researcher, noted the sudden emergence around the 6th century of images of Christ that shared many features, likely modeled on the Mandylion, that matched the shroud. He made particular note of 15 features that have come to be known as the Vignon markings. A single characteristic representation of Christ, beginning at the time the Mandylion was rediscovered, sharing so many features with the shroud, points to the Mandylion and the shroud being the same object. In all, Vignon identified 15 marks he thought derived from the shroud. The Mandylion is commonly portrayed in landscape format, as shown in this slide from a presentation by Ian Wilson. This suggests that it's a representation of the shroud folded so only the face appears. Let's shift gears a bit and visit another cloth. The sudarium, a small towel covered with blood, is thought to be the cloth that covered the head of Jesus as he was taken down from the cross and transported to the tomb. It has an entirely different history, yet it matches the Shroud of Turin. I used Mario Latendrisi's Shroud Scope site to match the scale of the facial image of the shroud in the face stain region of the sudarium, and then created an outline of contrast edges and overlaid it on the sudarium image. It was a fairly good match. Back in the late 1990s, Alan Wanger, using his polarized technique, made this video. It shows the match between the head wounds on the sudarium and the shroud. Both are type AB blood, yet the two linens have not been together for at least 1,400 years. The shroud left Jerusalem no later than about 40 AD, while the sudarium left Jerusalem in 614 AD. The travels of the two linens did not intersect. If they exhibit corresponding marks, they came from the same body. The Abgar legend developed over time. Eusebius speaks of the mission to Jesus seeking healing, but doesn't mention an image. The doctrine of Addai says that Jesus was painted in choice paints. Later still, the image is transferred as a moist secretion by Jesus himself and described as not made by human hands. Finally, miraculous powers are attributed to the cloth, and it saves the city of Edessa from conquest. Then in the 6th century, a liturgy describes seeing an image of the dead and risen man on the linens. In 1973, Dr. Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist, was permitted to take sticky tape samples from the shroud. He had pioneered this technique for obtaining samples at crime scenes. Pollens on the tapes placed the shroud in the Holy Land, Edessa, and Constantinople. Many of the pollens were heavy, insect-borne, rather than wind-borne. The depositing of the pollen could be due to the manufacturing of the linen, its presence in the ointments applied to the body, or from flowers laid on the shroud, possibly in liturgies. Dr. Marzia Boa, in her Valencia 2012 paper, points out a possible misclassification by Frey of Helichrysum as Gundelia terneforti. Helichrysum would likely have been deposited in oils or ointments used to prepare the body. Notice these two different micrographs of the pollens. They look very nearly identical, so it's quite easy to expect that there may very well have been a misclassification. Since they are insect-borne pollens, they were likely deposited during linen fabrication or in unguents used to anoint the body, or possibly from flowers that were laid on the shroud. We just don't know. Evagrius places the Mandylion firmly in Edessa in 544, but what exactly is it? The word tetradiplon appears in the Acts of Thaddeus, a 6th century work. It means doubled in 4, in short, 8 layers. With the shroud, this produces a landscape aspect with the disembodied head centered roughly in the middle. There seems to be a slightly faded halo around the head, possibly because it was exhibited and exposed to light with only the head showing. A similar landscape presentation of a head painted on a wooden panel was found at the location of a Knights Templar site in Temple Combe, Somerset. This is a plausible link between the Mandylion, the shroud, and the Templars. Folded in the tetradiplon configuration, the back, when the head is displayed, shows the prominent chest wound, which may explain our next witness. The chest wound's here, and here's the shroud folded. In 1943, a Byzantine army came to Edessa to obtain the Mandylion. 200 Muslim prisoners and a great deal of silver were exchanged for the Mandylion. The army returned to Constantinople in August of 944. On August 16th, the Archdeacon Gregory gave a sermon. He said, "The splendor has been impressed uniquely by the drops of agony sweat sprinkled from the face. These are truly the beauties that produced the coloring of Christ's imprint, which has been embellished further by the drops of blood sprinkled from his own side. Blood and water there, sweat and image here." The Mandylion was more than just a head image. 259 years later, in 1203, Robert de Clary, a chronicler of the Fourth Crusade, saw a shroud in which, literally where, our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday raised itself upright so that one could see the form of our Lord on it. The sack of Constantinople followed, and the shroud enters a period of silence. What is the shroud then? Jackson and Jumper conducted cloth wrapping experiments showing the image arose from a cloth-wrapped body. Jumper said, "There's only one way to correctly wrap the body." The shroud depicts the Passion of Christ. An anatomically perfect image, even to the fluorescent serum halos, it shows a first-century Roman crucifixion with signature details of the crowning with thorns, the scourging, the nailing, and a spear thrust to the side. Who would fake a negative image in the 14th or any earlier century? Artist copies of the Mandylion transform the image into a positive. Painted shroud copies are crude and unconvincing. It shouts authenticity. In 1978, the Sturp scientists detected dirt on the nose, knee, and heel, using reflectance spectrometry. Subsequently, it was classified as a form of travertine aragonite, a rare limestone identical to that found in Jerusalem. The marks of the scourging are consistent with the design of the first century flagrum. They're partially obscured on parts of the back, probably due to carrying the cross beam called the patibulum. The reconstructed history of the shroud is fragmentary, with extended periods of silence. One doesn't have to seek far for the reasons. Artistic traditions emerge after the 10th century when the image of Edessa is in Constantinople and revealed as more than just a disembodied head. The coincidence in timing points to the shroud. The progression of imagery from the melismos through the variations of the threnos and epitaphoe, and then the Man of Sorrows suggests the gradual spreading of an awareness of the real nature of the Mandylion is not merely a towel, but the full burial shroud. The Man of Sorrows is commonly shown rising from a box. The Prey Codex, dating from between 1192 and 1195, has an illustration that showed Jesus being anointed, laid out on a shroud with his arms crossed and thumbless hands. A pattern reminiscent of the herringbone weave of the shroud is seen on the detail, with a set of holes matching a pattern of burn holes on the shroud. John Jackson found a series of discolorations on the shroud, which he interpreted as the marks of a device used in Constantinople to raise the shroud out of a box. He reverse engineered and demonstrated the device in a BBC video. Robert de Clary reported this experience, and the Man of Sorrows images record a real memory of the Byzantine liturgies. Vignon noted a relationship between image intensity and distance and attempted to explain it with his vaporograph theory. On February 19, 1976, John Jackson and Bill Moturn put a picture of the shroud on a VP8 image analyzer and directly observed the three-dimensional characteristic of the shroud image. After the sack of Constantinople, another great silence in the shroud history begins. There is some evidence that it went to Athens with Othon de la Roche, who became the first Frankish lord of Athens in 1204. He may have sent it back to France, or perhaps it entered the custody of the Knights Templar and was used in their initiation rites. The story that connects the two theories has yet to be written. Whatever the case, the shroud reappears in secular history when it is displayed in a small church in Lurie about 1355, the property of a well-known but reverent knight named Geoffrey de Charny. In March of 1349, a fire destroyed the church in Besançon and apparently also a shroud kept there. In April 1349, Geoffrey de Charny writes to Clement VI, the fourth Avignon Pope, seeking to establish a church in Liry. Geoffrey married Jeannie de Varget, a descendant of Othon de la Roche, around 1349 as well. A painting was apparently prepared to replace the shroud that had been in Besançon, and the shroud we know of today as the Shroud of Turin began being displayed in Liry. The only account of the shroud's acquisition we have is a remark by Margaret de Clary that it was the spoils of war. Yeah, I know. There are only a few assumptions involved in carbon dating. The amount of C14 originally in the sample must be known. The sample must be representative of the item being dated. There must be no contamination or selective enrichment that would skew the date. Unless these are true, the date will be in error, and it is not uncommon for carbon dating to be in error. We've seen that the shroud dating has obvious problems of homogeneity and contamination. Are there any other alternatives? There are actually numerous dating alternatives, although none is likely as precise as carbon 14 dating. Ray Rogers has offered the decay of vanillin in the lignin of linen, showing that under normal circumstances, to have a null test for vanillin implies the image is at least 1,300 years old. Giulio Fonte has recently advanced a number of mechanical tests. Fonte, a professor of mechanical and thermal measurements at the Department of Industrial Engineering at the University of Padua, together with associates, has pioneered the development of new dating methods using the aging mechanical characteristics of linen fibers to estimate their age. These separate techniques mutually corroborate the likely first century date of the shroud. When we look at the journey we've just made and ask whether the tests of truth as reflected in direct observation by witnesses, correct interpretation, correspondences with other known truths, and coherence are reflected in our story, I think the answer is that they are, except for the surprising anomaly of the aberrant carbon date. Even that has a story yet to be fully explored. In summing up, there are two obvious conclusions. The first is that there is something wrong with the carbon date determined in 1988. It clearly is anomalous in the context of the other evidence. The other observation is that the bulk of the evidence tells a very coherent story which strongly suggests that the Shroud of Turin is indeed the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. There are still missing pieces, to be sure, but that is what gives the shroud its fascination. I would like to thank Barry Schwartz and Stira in particular for all of the work that they've done, and also I'd like to mention Barry Latendrisi, and quite frankly, a comment by John Jackson years ago at Elizabethtown. Maybe it wasn't Elizabethtown, maybe it was in Richmond, when he pointed out that when one bad result contradicts a lot of others, you don't throw out the other results. You look at the anomalous result. And I think that's what I've tried to do today. Thank you very much.